In that narrow alley, where clothes hung on the line, swayed in the wind, and the cold concrete held the stories of forgotten people, a cruel gesture had forever changed the fate of a family. The man in the impeccable suit, a symbol of power and rigidity, held in his arms a baby who belonged not only to him by blood, but also as the promise of a future denied. Without warning, without consultation, without even allowing the mother a voice, he decided to give away his own child, convinced that it would be just another contract to be signed in silence. The woman, kneeling before him, wept with the despair of someone watching their own heart being mercilessly ripped out, while strangers watched the drama helplessly. The years passed, but life takes its toll. He believed he had buried that secret beneath layers of arrogance and million-dollar business dealings, but time, relentless, always finds a way to expose what was done in secret. When he least expected it, the revelation arrived in a devastating way. Before him stood a young man, bearing not only the same firmness in his gaze, but also the same scar that marked his own skin. It was as if fate had left an impossible sign to deny, a visible reminder that no cruel act can be erased by the power of money or the desire to control everything. The sight of that simple, inescapable detail crumbled the castle of certainties he had built. Suddenly, all the nights he had believed himself safe became fragile, and the weight of the past returned with force to claim what he had tried to silence. And faced with this revelation that breaks barriers of time and lies, only one inevitable question remains: how to face the return of a son who carries in his body the living proof of the betrayal that you believed you had buried forever. If this story piques your curiosity, subscribe to the channel, like, and share so more people can follow each exciting twist. Before she became the woman kneeling amidst dust and scorn, Eun-ji was someone whose simple life held a quiet beauty few could see. Born in Busan, she grew up among narrow alleys and popular markets, where the bright colors of fruit stalls and the smell of fresh fish from the harbor mingled with the laughter of children running through the streets. The daughter of a fisherman and a seamstress, she learned from an early age that life would not be easy, but it could be beautiful if lived with honesty and love. While other young women dreamed of leaving their hometowns to live under the bright lights of Seoul, Eun-ji dreamed of keeping her small family together, caring for her parents and helping with what she could. She worked in silence, sewing clothes late into the night, lit only by the dim glow of a lamp, and yet still found time to smile sincerely at anyone who crossed her path. Her kindness was not only in the way she spoke, but in her attention to every detail of life, from the way she set the table to the warmth with which she welcomed neighbors in need. When you met Ji-hoon, he wasn't the tycoon the world would learn to fear, but simply an ambitious young man, full of plans and insecurities. For her, there was no greater light than seeing in him the strength of someone who wanted to succeed. Eun-ji supported him when he still had nothing, sharing bread, hopes, and sleepless nights in pursuit of a future that seemed distant. While the world ignored him, she believed in him as if she believed in herself. And so it was, amid shy laughter, small gestures of affection, and shared hope, that they were married. Eun-ji's dress wasn't luxurious, but every stitch had been embroidered by her own hands. The simple ceremony was marked by human warmth and the certainty that love was enough to weather any storm. For her, the greatest gift was the idea that with him, she would build a family that would never know the loneliness her parents endured. However, life has a cruel way of showing how time can turn promises into dust. With Ji-hoon's rise came the comparisons, the arrogant looks, and the hidden shame he carried at his wife's simplicity. And what had been the foundation of his story slowly began to feel like a burden. And it was in that silent turning point when success began to pull Ji-hoon's heart away from the love that had sustained him, that the shadow of arrogance entered the scene and would change their fates forever. What began as a small local business driven by Ji-hoon's determination soon turned into a dizzying climb to power. Within a few years, the ambitious young man who shared plain rice with Eun-ji became the name behind the company's expansion. He Group, one of South Korea's most talked-about corporations. His schedule became filled with gala dinners at luxurious Gangnam hotels, meetings in glass-enclosed skyscrapers, and political meetings that shaped the country's economic future. Each step toward the top seemed to push him further away from the woman who had once held his hand. Through nights of uncertainty, where there had once been tenderness, arrogance had emerged. Where there had once been complicity, now there was only indifference. Ji-hoon began to see Eun-ji not as the partner who had sustained his dreams, but as an uncomfortable reminder of a humble past he wished to bury. It was during this period that Seo Yeon appeared more strongly in his life. The daughter of an influential investor, possessing a calculated beauty and sharp words, she seemed to represent everything Ji-hoon believed he deserved: status, sophistication, and social recognition. At elite parties, she appeared beside him like a seductive shadow, hinting that he could be even greater if he abandoned the bonds that bound him to what he called mediocrity. Eun-ji, silent, felt the distance grow. She noticed the cold stares, the dinners he didn't attend, the rumors circulating in the company corridors. But, true to her promise to be by her husband's side, she kept quiet, believing that perhaps it was just a phase. Her heart clung to the memory of the man she had helped rise from the ashes, unaware that pride had already consumed almost everything in him. Ji-hoon, for his part, no longer hid his discomfort. He began correcting his wife's simple clothing, reprimanding her manner of speaking in front of guests, and leaving her out of official photographs. It was as if her every gesture was a reminder of a past he wanted to erase. And while the spotlight shone on his brilliant career, darkness began to creep into his home. Ji-hoon's arrogance grew like a wall, separating him further and further from the woman who had given him everything. And it was behind this wall of ego and contempt that the first invisible wound began to open, a wound that would only become evident in the silent humiliations that were to come. Over time, the house that had once been a haven of dreams became a stage of indifference. Eun-ji's home no longer held shared laughter, only the sound of heavy footsteps that echoed like a reminder of a distance impossible to ignore. Ji-hoon, now completely enveloped by power, saw in his wife only a shadow that didn't match the brilliance he believed she deserved. The first humiliations came in subtle tones, hidden in sharp words in front of guests. During a dinner, he forced her to serve wine glasses as if she were just another employee. Eun-ji walked amidst curious gazes, her heart racing, trying to hide the shame burning beneath her skin. Every muffled laugh from those present, every murmured comment about her simplicity was like a blow that knocked the wind out of her. In the company corridors, the humiliations were even more cruel. Ji-hoon not only ignored her, he even pretended not to know her in formal meetings. Once, while Seo Yeon flashed a provocative smile, he introduced his mistress as someone indispensable in his professional life, relegating his wife to an invisible role. Eun-ji remained silent, her dignity intact. But her teary eyes revealed the pain that words couldn't convey. At social gatherings, the humiliations became public. Ji-hoon, surrounded by executives and investors, made cruel comments about Eun-ji's lack of sophistication, comparing her in veiled terms to Seo Yeon's artificial elegance. Her silence, however, was not a sign of weakness. It was the last thread of strength that kept her standing, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. The nights were long, marked by emptiness. Eun-ji waited for a look, a gesture, a reminder of who he once was. But all she received was indifference. Ji-hoon no longer saw her pain, no longer saw the weight of the tears wetting his pillow. He was blinded by pride and the illusion that his life could only be complete without her presence. Eun-ji, however, kept each humiliation hidden in the silence of her soul, transforming the pain into something no one could see. She didn't explode, didn't scream, didn't retaliate. She simply observed, and in her eyes, a silent gleam began to emerge, not of revenge but of survival. And it was in this silence filled with pain that the definitive rupture began to form, until the day when the loss would not be just symbolic, but real, cruel, and irreversible. That year's winter seemed harsher than ever. Snow fell thinly over Seoul, coating the streets in white, but within Eun-ji's heart, there was no trace of purity or hope. Everything boiled down to the constant fear of losing what she had left. The son she held in her arms. She knew Ji-hoon no longer believed her words, knew Seo Yeon's insinuations had poisoned his heart. Even so, she never imagined the final blow would come so cold, so merciless, so irreversible. On the morning that would change her life forever, Eun-ji was summoned to appear in family court. She didn't understand right away, but her body was already trembling, as if she sensed the outcome. Upon arriving, she found Ji-hoon standing before the judge, his documents ready. The words rang like sharp blades. "This child is not mine. I want to formalize the adoption immediately." The shock made Eun-ji's legs weaken. Her eyes searched his, pleading for any shred of humanity. The judge watched her silently, while the social worker awaited instructions. The baby, oblivious to the tragedy, sobbed softly in his mother's arms, as if sensing he would be ripped from her arms. Eun-ji fell to her knees in the cold room and wept with a despair no one there would dare forget. "Please, Ji-hoon, he's your son. You know that. Don't take him away from me." Her voice echoed through the courtroom, but to Ji-hoon it was just an annoying noise. He looked away, as if each tear were an accusation he'd rather run away from. Seo Yeon, sitting a few feet away, watched the scene with a restrained smile as if savoring victory. It was clear that Eun-ji's fate was being sealed not only by her husband's coldness, but also by the cruel manipulation of her lover, who wanted to eliminate any trace of her rival. The judge hesitated, but given Ji-hoon's firm decision, nothing could be done. The papers were signed. The baby was handed over to the social worker, who carried him out of the room in tears. Eun-ji tried to run after him, but was restrained by staff, her desperate hands grasping the air, as if to reach the son ripped from her life. Her cries mingled with the child's, forming a tragic symphony that broke the hearts of those watching. Ji-hoon, motionless, simply adjusted his suit and left the room. He didn't say a word, didn't cast a glance, didn't show any remorse. For him, that chapter was over. For Eun-ji, it was the beginning of a life of darkness. That day, she lost everything: her home, her husband, her son, her hope. But amid the ashes of grief, there remained something no one could take away: her dignity. Even in tears, even as she lay on the cold courtroom floor, there was a silent promise in her eyes that the pain would not destroy her forever. The world seemed to collapse on her shoulders, but life always finds a way to move forward, and it would be precisely at this breaking point, when nothing else seemed possible, that a new path would begin to take shape. A path of pain, yes, but also of resistance, silence, and transformation. And so it was that, between tears and the emptiness of an abandoned crib, Eun-ji took the first step towards the deepest abyss of her existence, without imagining that from this same abyss would be born the force that would one day change everything. After court, life Eun-ji became a silent desert. She left her luxurious home in Seoul, not willingly, but because there was no longer a place for her there. The servants, once respectful, now regarded her with indifference, as if she were nothing more than a nuisance, All that remained was a suitcase filled with simple clothes and a heart shattered into pieces. The ride to Gyeongju was long and cold. On the train, Eun-ji remained silent, her eyes fixed on the window, the snow-covered landscape sliding past her like distant memories. Inside her mind, the baby's cries still echoed, as if each sob was a reminder that time would never return. She settled into a small, rented room in a village where no one knew her. The space was modest, peeling walls, a creaky wooden bed, and a side table lit by a dim bulb. In that solitude, she cried until she lost all strength, clutching the pillow as if it were the body of her son ripped from her arms. Not a day went by that she didn't wonder where he was, if he was warm, if someone was cradling him lovingly. Even immersed in grief, Eun-ji didn't allow herself to completely surrender to despair. She needed to survive, and to do so, she began sewing again, as she had in her youth. She spent hours with the needle in her hand, her tears staining the fabric, but each stitch was also a form of resistance. She sold small pieces at local markets, where no one knew her past, and thus managed to scrape together the bare minimum. Still, there were nights when the silence was unbearable. Sitting by the window, watching the village lanterns flicker in the distance, Eun-ji felt the whole world move on, except for her. The cold penetrated her bones, but the greatest pain was the absence of her son, of her home, of the life she had once believed eternal. Yet, behind the dejected expression, an invisible seed was beginning to germinate. Eun-ji didn't realize it at the time, but every tear shed, every silence endured, was shaping a strength that no amount of abandonment could destroy. And it was in this isolation, between cold nights and days of silent work, that something unexpected began to blossom within her. A subtle change that would become the beginning of her turning point. Time in Gyeongju passed slowly, almost cruelly. But little by little, Eun-ji began to transform that suffocating silence into a space of reconstruction. The pain still followed her like an inseparable shadow. But there were moments when the memory of her son didn't destroy her. On the contrary, it was precisely this memory that gave her the strength to carry on. It was on a rainy afternoon that she found, in an old box belonging to her mother, a fashion book that had been left aside for years. The yellowed pages displayed sketches of dresses, notes on fabrics, and sewing details. Touching those pages, Eun-ji felt a strange thrill. It was as if, in that moment, she remembered who she had been. Before everything fell apart, the young woman who dreamed of creating something beautiful with her own hands. Determined to start over, she began studying in secret. She spent her nights drawing, copying patterns from old magazines purchased at second-hand bookstores, and gradually developing her own style. The hours stretched by at the small wooden table, illuminated by the dim light of the lamp, as she scribbled sketches and patterns that, the next morning, would be tested on scraps of cheap fabric purchased at the market. At first, the pieces were simple, unfinished, but over time Eun-ji perfected her technique, creating garments that began to attract the attention of her neighbors. First, they were small repairs, then orders for modest dresses for local weddings. Each customer who knocked on her door carried more than one item of clothing. They also carried the silent hope that Eun-ji was finally finding a new purpose. She, however, revealed nothing. She kept her pain locked away, and her progress was like an intimate secret, a small flame that grew stronger every day. While Ji-hoon believed his abandoned wife had disappeared into oblivion, she silently grew stronger, stitching together not only fabrics, but also her new identity. The days that had once been endless now gained pace. There was always another piece to finish, another idea to sketch, another step toward a future no one imagined for her. Each stitch of the needle was also a scar transformed into strength. But while Eun-ji began to weave her turn in silence, in another corner of the city, Ji-hoon's empire, as solid as it seemed, began to show signs of cracks, signs that would soon become open wounds. While Eun-ji silently stitched together her new life, in Seoul the glow of his group began to fade. The company, once celebrated as a symbol of innovation and power, now faced rumors of corruption and internal embezzlement. Uneasy investors spread doubts in luxurious corridors, and newspapers insinuated that Ji-hoon's era of prosperity might not be as solid as it seemed. At first, he ignored it. He was accustomed to seeing obstacles as mere stumbling blocks in the way of his ambition. But this time, the signs multiplied rapidly. Contracts cancelled, shareholders selling off shares en masse, and the press publishing increasingly aggressive articles. It was as if fate itself was beginning to exact the full measure of his mistakes. For Ji-hoon, the first big wound came not just from the Seoul numbers, but from the people. CEO Yeon, the seemingly devoted lover, revealed her true colors. From one day to the next, she disappeared, taking with her a significant amount of embezzled investment funds. The news hit like a bombshell. Close friends whispered about betrayal, rivals smirked, and Ji-hoon, for the first time, found himself alone in his luxurious penthouse, surrounded by wealth but plunged into a suffocating void. The nights, once filled with parties and champagne, became long and silent. The sound of the wind beating against the windows seemed to mock his loneliness. Ji-hoon drank to try to silence the inner voices that haunted him, but nothing could silence the echo of the cruel decisions he had made. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the ambitious young man full of life. He saw only a tired man, corroded by pride and the growing guilt. In the company's corridors, employees whispered about his fragility. In the newspapers, headlines questioned his leadership abilities. The empire, which seemed untouchable, was slowly crumbling before his eyes. And although Ji-hoon wouldn't admit it out loud, one memory kept coming back to him in his weakest moments. The image of Eun-ji kneeling in the courtroom, begging for what he had destroyed with his own hands. And it would be precisely when the mask of power began to crack that an unexpected presence would cross her path again, not as a victim, but as someone transformed, ready to surprise the man who believed he had erased her forever. The years had passed like a silent river that flows unnoticed, but ultimately shapes the entire landscape. What had once been a secluded seamstress in Gyeongju had become a respected designer whose creations began to circulate discreetly in fashion circles in Seoul. Eun-ji, with her quiet talent and tireless perseverance, had achieved what Ji-hoon had never believed possible: recognition. Her brand, born of simple fabrics and sleepless nights, now graced the windows of boutiques catering to young executives, rising actresses, and even the wives of the political elite. The name that had once carried shame was now spoken with admiration. But Eun-ji wasn't seeking revenge. Her strength lay elsewhere, showing, simply by living, that she didn't need anyone's approval to exist fully. It was at a charity gala night, organized by He Group. It was in the midst of the crisis that fate crossed their paths again. Ji-hoon, pressured by shareholders and the media, sought to restore the company's image. The event room of the luxurious Gangnam Hotel was illuminated by crystal chandeliers, and hundreds of guests were dressed in the pomp typical of high society. He walked around the room, trying to maintain a proud posture, even though inside it was just a house of cards about to collapse. Suddenly, the camera flashes turned toward the entrance. The doors opened and, as if time had stopped, Eun-ji walked across the room. He wore a modern hanbok, reinterpreted with elegant cuts, blending tradition and sophistication. His serene gaze sought no confrontation, but his presence was so striking that it seemed to reshape the room. The buzz spread quickly. Some recognized her as the abandoned wife. Others identified her as the fashion designer who had been so talked about in recent months. For Ji-hoon, the sight was a punch in the gut. His heart raced, and for a moment he didn't know if it was real or if the past, once buried, had decided to take revenge by appearing before him. Eun-ji walked with firm steps, each movement conveying the confidence she had gained on her solitary journey. There was no hatred in her eyes, nor any desire to humiliate. What there was something even more devastating to Ji-hoon, the quiet dignity of someone who had survived hell and emerged stronger than ever. During the evening's presentation, when the event's supporting designers were being announced, her name was called. The lights shone brightly on the stage, and the audience applauded. Ji-hoon, sitting in the front row, felt the weight of the irony. The woman he had dismissed, treated as nothing, now appeared there, recognized, admired, untouchable. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. Her every gesture was like a mirror, forcing him to see his choices. As Eun-ji offered a few brief thanks, her firm, calm voice echoed through the room, making it clear she was no longer the same submissive woman she'd once been. She didn't mention her husband, didn't make accusations, didn't seek to expose wounds. But in her silence there was more power than in any speech. Ji-hoon felt something inside him crumble. This was no longer the wife he'd rejected. She was a woman reborn, one who no longer needed him to exist, and that simple fact ate at him more than any declared revenge could. But the night held an even more devastating revelation. For among the unfamiliar faces who milled about as volunteers at that event was someone who bore not only the echo of a forgotten past, but also the physical mark that would reveal the whole truth. A scar capable of changing everyone's fate forever. The hall was already filled with the glow of the chandeliers and the murmur of guests when event volunteers began circulating among the tables. Young students handed out programs and helped with the setup. Ji-hoon, still shaken by Eun-ji's presence, tried to maintain his posture, but the cold sweat on the back of his neck betrayed the chaos within. It was then that his eyes fell on a thin young man in a simple uniform, carrying boxes onto the stage. There was something about the boy that caught his attention, a disconcerting familiarity that he couldn't immediately explain. The young man, named Min-jun, he moved naturally, but there was a firmness in his gaze that contrasted with his age. At one point, while helping position materials, Min-jun stumbled and let out a soft groan of pain. Without thinking, he lifted the hem of his shirt to wipe the sweat from his forehead, and in that trivial gesture, he revealed a long scar marked on the left side of his abdomen. Ji-hoon froze. The world around him seemed to lose its sound, as if only that detail existed. It was impossible to mistake them. That scar was identical to the one he'd carried since childhood, the result of a fall that had nearly cost him his life. The CEO's heart raced, and his breathing became labored. The image from years ago came back like a flash. The crying baby, in Eun-ji's arms, being ripped from her for adoption. Ji-hoon's hands were shaking. He stood up abruptly, drawing curious glances, and approached the boy. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice breaking. Min-jun, surprised by the approach, replied simply, "Min-jun, sir. I came as a volunteer for the institution." The name echoed in Ji-hoon's mind like a whisper of fate. His eyes welled up in spite of himself. The weight of all the years, of all the cruel decisions, crashed down on him like an avalanche. He tried to smile, but could only manage a gentle grip on the boy's arm, as if afraid he would disappear again. The guests watched in silence, unable to comprehend what was happening. Eun-ji, from afar, observed the scene. Her heart raced. for she too recognized the impossible. The son ripped from her arms years ago was there, alive before her. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't tears of despair, but tears of a truth finally coming to light. Ji-hoon fell to his knees, forgetting his ruthless CEO image. The entire room fell silent as he watched such a powerful man bow before a young stranger. But for him, there was no ignorance. There was regret. There was the certainty that the past, no matter how hard he tried to bury it, had returned with full force to claim him. He wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, to explain his blindness, but the words wouldn't come. Only sobs tore from his chest. Min-jun watched him, confused, unable to understand why a man of that size seemed to be begging for something he couldn't name. Eun-ji approached slowly. Her footsteps echoed through the room like the beating of a heart returning to life. Ji-hoon looked up at her, and in that instant, he understood the extent of his ruin. Everything he had destroyed was there before him. The wife he had rejected, the son he had denied, the family he had sacrificed for pride. But fate still had the final blow in store. It wasn't enough to acknowledge the truth. It would be necessary to face Eun-ji's choice, a silent choice that would decide whether Ji-hoon would have any chance of redemption, or whether he would live forever crushed by the weight of his guilt. The hall remained utterly silent. Ji-hoon was still on his knees before his son, a man accustomed to being feared, now reduced to a frail body, broken by the weight of his own mistakes. The tears streaming down his face were not just of regret, but of despair, as if wanting to return the years he could never regain. Eun-ji walked slowly toward them, each step carrying the memory of a past that burned like fire in her mind. The woman who had once been humiliated and reduced to silence now approached with the dignity of someone who needed no revenge to be strong. Her elegant dress gleamed in the light of the hall, but it was her serene posture that commanded respect. When she reached Ji-hoon, she stopped. The look she gave him wasn't one of anger nor tenderness. It was the look of someone who had already learned to live without the need for answers. Ji-hoon raised his head, pleading, his voice breaking. "Eun-ji, I was wrong. I was wrong with you. I was wrong with him. Forgive me." The request, which many in the room never imagined they would hear, fell heavily in the air. For a moment it seemed everyone was waiting for the explosion, the suppressed scream, the long-awaited revenge. But Eun-ji didn't scream. There was no outburst. There was only silence. She leaned forward slightly, placed her hand on her son's shoulder, and in a firm, low voice said, "Take good care of what's left, Ji-hoon." There was no accusation. There was no rancor, just the final sentence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Her silence was more devastating than any words could have been. Ji-hoon felt it like a blow piercing his soul. He tried to follow her with his eyes, but Eun-ji turned calmly, walking beside Min-jun, as if ending not just a conversation, but an entire life. The hall remained motionless, stunned. For many, that moment was more powerful than any scandal. Eun-ji had won without needing to destroy. She had won simply by choosing to no longer participate in the cruel game that had crushed her in the past. But the story wasn't over yet. There remained the last page, where fate would show who had truly found peace and who would have to live forever within their own ruin. Time passed, but its marks remained like invisible scars that, instead of becoming ugly, became symbols of strength. Eun-ji's life, once marked by abandonment and pain, found new meaning alongside Min-jun, not only as a recovered son, but as a reason to keep dreaming. The two walked together through quiet streets, sharing simple conversations, discreet laughter, and the serenity that only true reunion can provide. There was no luxury in their days, but there was peace, and that was the wealth no one could ever steal. Time had transformed each of Eun-ji's tears into seeds of courage. It was no longer about looking back and mourning what was lost, but about cherishing every moment gained after so much suffering. When she walked Min-jun to school or prepared his meals, she felt that life had given her back, in simple gestures, a happiness that could not be bought. There were days when simply watching her son sleep was enough to reaffirm that all the journey she had traveled had not been in vain. Her name, previously associated only with small boutiques, began to occupy larger spaces. Fashion magazines highlighted her creative vision. Television programs chronicled her career as an example of overcoming adversity, and aspiring young people saw in her not just a designer, but a woman who rose above all else even when all seemed lost. However, the greatest reward lay not in fame or public recognition. It lay in the silence of quiet nights, when she could look at her son and know that fate, in some mysterious and just way, had given him back what had once been taken from her. While Eun-ji flourished, Ji-hoon sank into an abyss he had dug himself. The man who once dominated boardrooms and was applauded at international conferences now wandered alone in his luxurious penthouse, surrounded by cold walls and memories that kept him awake. The enormous windows offered views of the illuminated city, but his eyes saw nothing but emptiness. The silence of his home was deafening, filled only with the echo of the conscience that tormented him. He tried to escape through low-key parties, expensive drinks, and aimless travels, but nothing filled the hole he carried inside. The weight of regret had become unbearable. No amount of wealth or power could buy back what he had lost: the love of the woman he had scorned and the respect of the son he had rejected. His ruin was not caused by financial failure or lawsuits, but by the irreversible loneliness he had built himself, brick by brick, each time he chose pride over affection. Those around him commented on his decline. Some criticized him with contempt, recalling the humiliations he had inflicted. Others, more compassionate, expressed pity at seeing him reduced to the shadow of what he had once been. But nothing compared to the silent judgment of his own conscience. Ji-hoon lived in a prison without bars, where every memory of the court, every tear from Eun-ji, and every glance from Min-jun were invisible chains that kept him chained to the past. There were nights when he dreamed of his son running to him, calling him Dad. But when he woke, the emptiness of his bed and the cold of the house reminded him that this dream would never come true. Each morning was harder than the last, for life was carrying the burden of knowing he had everything and lost it because of choices he thought were wise, but which now revealed themselves to be his greatest folly. Eun-ji, on the other hand, didn't wish for his destruction. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't need to see him in ruins to feel complete. Her victory lay in moving on, in proving that pain hadn't been enough to strip her of her dignity. She knew that life would exact its full toll, and that there was no crueler punishment than watching one's own empire crumble while she remained alone. True poetic justice lay neither in shouting nor in retaliation. It lay in the simple fact that Ji-hoon had engineered his own downfall, while she, with steady hands and a resilient heart, built the bridge to a peaceful future. With each of her achievements, with each of her son's smiles, the contrast between their fates became more evident. She didn't need to destroy anything. He built the ruin with his own hands. On a cold autumn afternoon, Eun-ji walked with Min-jun down a street covered in yellowing leaves. The light wind brought back memories of everything they had experienced, but there was no longer pain, only gratitude. Her son, smiling at her side, was living proof that no amount of humiliation could destroy what truly mattered: dignity, true love, and the hope of a new beginning. The past hadn't disappeared, but it had become merely a chapter, no longer the defining feature of her life. She didn't need to look back. because the present already offered her everything she'd ever dreamed of. Not luxury, not wealth, but the freedom to be who she'd always been, without chains or shadows. And so, between the fall of a man who lost everything and the silent rise of a woman who rebuilt her own story, fate proved it. Can be cruel, but it can also be fair. In the end, each reaped exactly what they sowed. Ji-hoon reaped loneliness and regret. Eun-ji reaped peace and respect. If this story touched your heart, showing how quiet strength can overcome even the greatest injustices, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Your presence here is what keeps intense stories like this alive, reminding us that there is always a path to a new beginning.